call it straight line is because when you developed this, it happened to be with Oakmont or Stratton Oakmont. Was it Oakmont Stratton or Stratton Oakmont?
Stratton Oakmont. The reason I called it the straight line, and it's really interesting because the straight line.
And by the way, do you still have to leave at 250?
Yeah, like 2:55. That could be 10 minutes late. It's fine. It's another meeting, but he's a good friend of mine. So and it's a CBD meeting I told you about, right? So anyway, so we call it the straight line. Because I had this really weird thing going on at Stratton. Before I invented Stratton as it was Stratton, which was selling $5 stocks to the richest 1%. That's what we did. We sold $5 stocks, $5 to $10 stocks to the richest Americans out there. Business owners, investors who had a lot of money. When they bought something, they didn't invest $50 or $5,000. They invest $1 million in it. They were big players, right? And the idea was that I tested this idea myself, along with my junior partner, Danny. And the results that we got was so phenomenal that I decided to reinvent my firm. At the time, we were selling penny stocks to average moms and pops. Those are 10-cent stocks to poor people. So I was getting this incredible result, like extraordinary. So one trade in my new system with Danny and I could be $1 million trade with a $300,000 commission. One sale. In the
How many of those a week?
30 a day.
Just cleaning up.
Like you couldn't imagine, Brad. It's like printing.
Dude, that's what I want to get into. Only because if I were listening to this interview, I'd be like, fuck the straight line bullshit. I want to talk about the Lambos and the asses.
I'll
and the
tell
cocaine.
you that. I'll answer this quickly, and I'll tell you about that. Because what paved the way for all that was the straight line. Because what happened is that when I hit on this system of selling $5 stocks to the richest 1%, we had the ability to make hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Easily. It was like taking candy from a baby. It was simple, right? And I had these 12 kids working for me that I, kid around and say they had the average IQ of Forrest Gump on 3 hits of acid. They weren't sharp. These were kids that had not
Was one of them Guletta?
Guletta was one of them. Oh, yeah, he was one. And Guletta's now you see Guletta as like he can close, but he was basically a walking idiot back then with a fucking terrible drinking problem, which he probably still has. Anyway, separate issue.
And all of them New York.
All New York, all from disempowered backgrounds. These were kids that were never told by their parents.
So the bad news bears.
It was the bad news bears. They were never told by their parents they were capable of greatness. Any greatness they had naturally in them beaten out of them. So when I tried to teach them how to close rich people, they couldn't do it. So I'm doing it. Danny's doing it. We're getting this incredible. I'm closing 50% of the people I speak to. Danny's closing a third. Yet when I have my 12 kids, they're closing 0. Same pitch, same stock, same system. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? How could we be doing the same activity and getting these diametrically opposed results? And that was the time when I went all over the country and looked at everyone else's sales training systems, because I was teaching a system that didn't have a name back then, and it was really good, I thought, but it wasn't good enough for that. And then I had this terrible awakening when I went around the country. I'm like, shit, my shit's better than their stuff, and my stuff's not working. I tried all the Hopkins, all this stuff, no disrespect. I tried all that stuff early on. None of it worked. So I was stuck. Went back to my firm after this trip to L.A. where I went to this big seminar of all the salespeople, right? And I was out of time. The guys were going to quit because they couldn't close rich people. And it was in that evening that I basically invented the straight line. And the thesis basically was, I looked at these guys and just to give you the short story here, it's like, don't you guys get it? Every sale's the same. And they're like, what? I'm like, every sale's the same. And this idea just popped into my head. I'm like, watch. It's a straight line. And I drew this line, this long, thin line across the center of the whiteboard, and I put a big, thick X on either end. And basically what it was this. In my mind, selling was so simple as a natural born closer that I had this certain predictable way. It was so simple to me that I was taking immediate control of the conversation and then lining up these certain elements, doing it the same way every single time because I was in control. And to me, it was all happening in this very orderly fashion. Yet if you ask the average person who's not a natural born closer, and even if you ask natural born closers who haven't thought it through, you say, what do you do when you sell? They're like, I convince people. But what are you really doing, though? Like people, I don't know, like what are you really doing? Well, what's a straight line represented? It was a context for people to say, imagine this is what's happening. This is the beginning. This is the end. And as as you're talking, every word you say, everything you do, every document you might hand them, this is before the internet in the beginning, right? What you're doing is you're looking to line up these core elements, moving them down the line from a place of uncertainty to absolute certainty. And at the end of the day, when you close someone, it's because you've made them really, really certain about a few different things. Mm-hmm. Now, for me, that was happening automatically. They couldn't do it. For some reason, when I drew it on a line, it opened up this whole way of thinking about its goal-oriented communication, meaning it's not just a random conversation. There's an outcome in mind.
Even though it sounds like it.
It sounds like it, but what's happening is it started with this idea that I realized what it was. My kids were just that. They were kids. They weren't that educated. They would get on the phone with the business owner. He'd hear them for 2 seconds, say, novice. I get on the phone, hey, Mr. Jones, and I had a certain way of talking and sounding.
Confidently.
Certain way, whatever it was, the words, the tonality, that within 4 seconds, I was hitting these buttons, and I'm sharp as a tack, enthusiastic as hell, expert in my field. And what that did, when someone perceives you as being an expert, what do? They defer to you. They allow you to guide them through a conversation. We've been conditioned to essentially defer to experts. When we were sick as kids, we went to a doctor. They're experts. We ask their questions. If you think you're being interviewed by a novice, you'll fuck with them. So when I position myself just as an expert, I could then run the same strategy every time. So that straight line represented this idea from which everything else flowed. And that next morning, because it was a nighttime meeting I gave, next morning they came back, and these kids who formerly couldn't close a fucking door went on an account opening spree that's now the subject of the biggest movie of all time. It was all because of the straight line. Then came all the Ferraris and Lamborghinis and insanity because there's other things involved as well. The straight line was so powerful that I could take these kids and turn them into $1 million producers like that. But if their standards were too low, like you said, what does someone really need to be? People look at me and say, shit, you don't even make your first 100 million. Well, guess what? These kids thought if they made 100 grand, that's all the money in the world. I had to change that, those beliefs in them. So at the same time I was teaching them about, how do you close? I was saying, guys, if you don't make 300, 400 grand your first year, you're fucking suspect. Second year, you better make $750,000 or you're considered weak and worthless. Year 3, $2 million are a complete fucking laughing stock.
Yeah, but that's because it was possible.
It was possible.
And people were doing it.
Because of the straight line made it possible, and the industry that it was in allowed them to make an extraordinary amount of money. So and this is true, it's a good point you're making. Every industry has its own level of money you can make. Like, for instance, Wall Street, people are overpaid. You take that same straight line system, and you're probably not going to make $8 million a year. You'll make $4 million in something else. But what you will be is the top in your industry. That's the point. It will turn you into the most effective closer in your industry. How much you make is depending on what industry. Some industries pay more than others.
Yeah, so pick a different industry. But here's
real estate, a lot of money. You can make. I have a friend of mine now. He's using the straight line, the biggest commercial real estate broker or agent in the country.